The Speaker of the Knesset, the Honorable M.K. Yuli Yoel Edelstein, Lord Rothschild, the Chairman of the World Zionist Organization, Mr. Abraham Duvdevani, Director General of the Knesset, Albert Sacharovich, and the Ambassador of the United Kingdom to Israel, His Excellency, Mr. David Quarry. Please be seated. Speaker of the Knesset, Honorable M.K. Yuli Yoel Edelstein, Lord Rothschild and the Rothschild family, Lord Pollack, the Right Honorable John Ryan, MP, welcome. Ambassador of the United Kingdom to Israel, Mr. David Quarry, Chairman, Zionist Executive of the World Zionist Organization, Abraham Duvdevani, members of Knesset, Hilik Bar, Shuli Moalem-Rafaeli, Director General of the Knesset, Albert Sacharovich, Secretary General of the Knesset, Yardena Melech-Horovitz, Cabinet Secretary, Tzachi Braverman, CEO, B'nai B'rith International, Daniel Mariashin, dear guests. The Balfour Declaration is a significant milestone in the history of the State of Israel. However, the path from declaration to independence was not a straight one. The years following the declaration saw the rise of Nazism and fascism. 1/3 of the world Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. At that point, the idea that the Jewish people would experience rebirth in the land of Israel seemed impossible. Yet, 100 years after the declaration, 70 years after the State of Israel was created, we are here at the Knesset, the heart of Israel's democracy, celebrating the declaration and its meaning. To begin our event today, I would like to welcome Dr. Ellen Weber, the Chairman of the Balfour Centenary Committee and the Chairman of this conference.
Bereshut Yoshev-Rosh HaKnesset, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the B'nai B'rith World Center and the Balfour Centenary Committee, I have the honor to welcome you to this international conference. The Balfour Centenary Committee was set up by the Israel, Britain and Commonwealth Association some 3 years ago, and it comprises representatives of the major English-speaking organizations in Israel. The Association of Americans and Canadians in Israel, the B'nai B'rith World Center, Ezra, the English-speaking Residents Association, Telfed, the South African Zionist Federation, Hob Hitachut Olei Britannia, the World Zionist Organization, Israel Forever, and the Jewish Historical Society of England. These various organizations have arranged a program of events which will continue through 2018. We are grateful to the members of the various sessions who have come both from abroad and Israel for agreeing to participate today. Among them are many distinguished scholars, eminent parliamentarians, and diplomats. We appreciate that they found the time in their busy schedules to share their expertise with us. Lord Rothschild wrote in an article in the Times last month that his great-uncle had said that the Balfour Declaration was the most important moment in Jewish history in the last 1800 years. And this was paralleled by Theresa May, referring it to as one of the most important letters in history. For the first time, it brought Zionist aspirations into the political horizon of the great powers and started the trail through the League of Nations, culminating in the United Nations vote to establish Medina Israel. This conference will examine historical aspects of the Declaration, and in the second session will discuss current Israel-British relations, concluding with an address by Lord Rothschild. We are grateful to the Speaker of the Knesset for hosting this conference and for his support from the very outset. These events do not take place by themselves. Our thanks go to Alan Schneider, Director of the B'nai Brit World Center, who initiated and organized this event over the last 2 years, to Daniel Taub for his advice, and to the staff of the Knesset for their support. I now have pleasure in asking Speaker Yoel Edelstein to address the conference.
Shalom, Bruchim Abayim LaKnesset, welcome to all of you. We have a very good tradition here in the Knesset. Once the Master of Ceremonies gives the list of all the distinguished guests present here, not every speaker has to repeat all the names, so just welcome Lord Rothschild, Ambassador, and all our partners. I want to thank actually all our partners, Alan, the way you did already, in making not this event, a series of events possible. And I'm not sure that all the members of Knesset would agree with me, but it's also nice to hear now the opening remarks of Dr. Weber, because it gives me the feeling of something that is lacking in this country, that of political stability. Because I remember distinctly when this nice group, distinguished group actually of ladies and gentlemen present here came into my office a couple of years ago describing all the plans for marking 100 years of the Balfour Declaration. I was very polite, I listened carefully, I said absolutely, but then I said also, what the hell are they talking about in 2 years? Who knows who'll be the Speaker of the Knesset, who knows who'll be here? Anyway, so except for the 100 years of the Jewish history, there's also political stability. And I'll start with something I definitely can't not notice. 100 years ago, I know I'm not original, but there were two big news items in the press. One on November 8, November 9 was the front page news. And it was the great Bolshevik revolution in St. Petersburg. The other one was a much smaller item, somewhere, as we say, page 8 or page 9, whatever the case was, and it was the Balfour Declaration. And it would be totally irresponsible to say, once again, definitely not me, totally irresponsible to say that the first event was not important. It was important. We can't ask tens of millions of people who are dead because of that event, but I guess them and their families believe the event was terribly important. We can't ask dozens of millions of prisoners scattered not just for 70 years all over the Soviet Union, but also half of the world. They would definitely say the event was important. We can't ask all the victims of oppression from South America to Cambodia and some African countries, the event was important. But it's gone. For 70 years, that news item was holding, as I've said, with terrible results. But you know, it's not just in Hollywood movies. In reality, too, real truth, real things, real news, in the end prevail. And we are here marking 100 years of something totally different, of a dream come true, of against all odds, of a startup nation, of the ingathering of the exiles the way it never happened in history. Oh yes, I know for a fact it was not just because of the 67 words written on a nice piece of paper. when those words were written, as many mentioned already, on different occasions during the last year, there was already a dream of 2,000 years to come back. There were already pioneers working the land in this country. There were lots of people eager to follow. There were lots of those who really followed. But having said all that, I think that it was the first and definitely very meaningful and important sign of support coming from a prominent member from a very high position in the international community. And that, I guess, once again, I was not alive there then, but I guess for someone who was just dreaming or planning or doing, it was a great additional sign of hope. It's not just me, it's not just, pardon my non-British language, but a bunch of crazies like me. It's the international community. It's British government. It's Lord Balfour. There is a chance. And I think what we are witnessing right now in this building, you know, I had a very strange thought on our way down here with Lord Rothschild and the distinguished guests. In an elevator was one of the ushers of the Knesset with us. And I actually wanted to say to him, you know, if it were not for the event 100 years ago, and if it were not for the Rothschild family in both senses 100 years ago and building this building, you probably wouldn't have a job. I know it sounds once again like a funny thought, but sometimes we think funny thoughts on serious and important historic occasions. What I'm trying to say, it's not about just historic events and paying debts to history. It's not about something very general, the history of the world and the history of the Jewish people. It's about each one of us present in this room and about millions of others not present here on this specific occasion. So I want to thank you all for coming, for sharing this historic moment with us. I'm looking forward, and I'm thankful to all the prominent members of academia and the public figures who are going to address us during the day. Don't please hold anything against members of Knesset. We have a working day, including votes right now in the committees. So if you see a member of Knesset who comes to listen and then runs out, it's not impoliteness or anything of the kind. It's just a regular working day. And I wish us all a lot of success during this event. I can't, I guess, wish us personally, but I'd have to wish this country and this building, the Knesset, to celebrate 200 years in even better circumstances that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, in the meantime, joined us a few Knesset members. I see here member of the Knesset Anat Berko, member of the Knesset Nurit Koren, member of the Knesset Eli Alaluf, member of the Knesset Nachman Shai. Thank you for joining us. We are honored to welcome the Ambassador of the United Kingdom to Israel, His Excellency Mr. David Quarry. Ambassador Quarry will deliver a special message from British Prime Minister Theresa May.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. As you just said, I've been asked to deliver the following message on behalf of the Right Honourable Theresa May, MP, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. As Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, it is an honour for me to send this special message to the Knesset, the home of democracy in Israel, as we mark together the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. The letter by Lord Balfour in November 1917 is, I believe, one of the most significant in history. Written in an era of competing imperial powers and in the middle of the First World War, the idea of establishing a homeland for the Jewish people would have seemed a distant dream for many and been fiercely opposed by others. Yet it was at this very moment that Lord Balfour had the vision and leadership to make this profound statement about restoring a persecuted people to a safe and secure homeland. So when some people say we should apologise for this letter, I say absolutely not. The United Kingdom is proud of its pioneering role in the creation of the State of Israel, and we are proud to declare our support for Israel. We're also proud of all that Israel stands for, as a symbol of openness, as a thriving democracy, as a beacon to the world in upholding the rights of women and members of the LGBT community. As I discussed with Prime Minister Netanyahu last week, we want to take that relationship between our two countries even further, deepening our links in areas where Israel is leading the world, like agriculture, health, science, technology and innovation. But Israel is the true startup nation, and the United Kingdom is proud to be your partner. We are also absolutely committed to Israel's security. We will always support the right of Israel to defend itself. And in a world where the United Kingdom and Israel increasingly face the same shared challenges and threats, I am clear that our security services will continue to deepen their already excellent cooperation to keep all of our people safe. But marking this centenary is not just about what has been achieved. We must recognise how difficult at times this journey has been, from the Jews forced out of their homes in Arab countries in 1948 to the suffering of Palestinians affected and dislodged by Israel's birth, both completely contrary to the intention of Balfour to safeguard all of these communities. And we must, I believe, seize this opportunity to renew our resolve on what is still to be achieved. For sadly, Balfour remains unfinished business. So as we mark this special anniversary, let us redouble our efforts in striving for a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. Let us condemn unequivocally the scourge of anti-Semitism wherever it is found, including among those who seek to deny the right of Israel to exist, the proponents of anti-Semitism in its newest form. Let us take inspiration from the vision of Lord Balfour as we work together for a future where Arabs and Jews can live in peaceful coexistence. And as we look to that future, let us mark with pride what has been achieved with the creation of the State of Israel, and in Lord Balfour's own words, a national home for the Jewish people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Quarry. Thank you so much. I'd like to welcome Mr. Avraham Duvdevani, Chairman of the Zionist Executive of the World Zionist Organization. Mr. Duvdevani, please.
First of all, I was not aware that this meeting will be in English, so I prepare what I have to say in Hebrew, and I say it in Hebrew. So I hope there is a translation here, so it's no problem. אדוני יושב ראש הכנסת, לורד, שגריר, בכנסת, מכובדיי כולם, באמת ציבור מאוד מאוד מכובד. כשמדברים על הצהרת בלפור, ואומרים מה היה כל כך חשוב הצהרת בלפור? אם לוקחים את הטקסט, אז זה הטקסט שההסתדרות הציונית לא הכילה לו. הייתה טיוטה ונשלחה ללורד בלפור לפני כן, טיוטה שהכינה ההסתדרות הציונית. שם הדברים היו הרבה יותר מפורשים, הרבה יותר קונקרטיים, הרבה יותר מחייבים, ובסוף יצא נוסח כפי שאנחנו מכירים אותו. עובדים, גדלות, לממש את ההצלחה, את הרעיון. באופן כללי בית לאומי, אבל התשובה שנותנים אותה בצורה חד משמעית, שההצהרה מדינית של בריטניה באותו זמן הייתה מאז הרצל שקבע את הדרך של הציונות, שהסיכוי להגיע בסוף למדינה הוא רק אם ילכו גם בדרך המדינית, בדרך של הכרת האומות, בדרך של הדיפלומטיה וכו'. מאז הרצל זה היה האקט הראשון שאיזושהי מדינה הכירה, נתנה הגדרה שמכירה בבית לאומי לעם היהודי בארץ ישראל. זו הייתה פריצת דרך. פשוט לא כל כך חשוב מה שהיה כתוב שם כמו הדבר עצמו, ההצהרה עצמה. עצם ההצהרה הייתה כי בלי תמיכה של העולם ושל המדינות, במיוחד של המעצמות, לא היה אפשרות להגיע בסוף להקמת מדינת ישראל. והצהרת בלפור היא הצעד הראשון בכיוון הזה של הכרה של האומות, שבסופו של דבר הגיע אחר כך לאומות המאוחדות בנובמבר 47, ושאנחנו עכשיו מציינים 70 שנה להכרת האו"ם. כל זה לא היו מגיעים לזה אילולא אותו נייר קצר עם כמה שורות. אז זאת היא התשובה בדרך כלל האמיתית העניינית. אבל אני רוצה לתת את זה כרגע לא מהזווית הבינלאומית, לא מהתרומה הבינלאומית, אלא מהסתכלות פנימית של העם היושב בציון, של העם היהודי שמייחל למדינה. בזמן הצהרת בלפור, לפני זה, מי שהיה אחר כך הרב הראשי לארץ ישראל, הרב אברהם יצחק הכהן קוק, בזמן מלחמת העולם הראשונה הוא נתקע בשוויץ, והוא הוזמן על ידי הקהילה באנגליה לבוא לשמש ברבנות באנגליה. כך שבזמן כל העניין הזה של הצהרת בלפור, הרב קוק היה באנגליה. אם אתה רוצה לדעת מה המשמעות הלאומית של הצהרת בלפור, הלאומית הישראלית, תבדוק מה קרה שם. הייתה התנגדות של הציבור החרדי שישב בעיקר בפרנקפורט, ששלחו לממשלת בריטניה בקשה לא לתת את הצהרת בלפור, כי זה מנוגד לדת היהודית וזה פוגע בדת. באנגליה כמדינה דתית צריכה לקחת את זה בחשבון. זה שהחרדים התנגדו זה כבר סימן שהדבר הזה הוא מאוד משמעותי וחשוב מבחינה לאומית. ואז ענו להם מממשלת בריטניה שנמצא פה באנגליה הרב אברהם יצחק הכהן קוק, והוא הסמכות הכי גבוהה בנושא הדתי, והוא חושב שזה דבר חיוני, הכרחי ונכון לעשות את ההצהרה, וההצהרה ניתנה. הרב קוק, כשהוא כותב באגרות שלו, ומתאר את התקופה הזו של מה שהיה באנגליה, הוא כותב שמהלך שגאולת ישראל קיבל דחיפה גדולה מאוד על ידי הצהרת בלפור. התחלת בגאולה והולכת, או ודאי הולכת ומופיעה לעינינו. הוא ראה בזה אקט של גאולת ישראל. והתחלת בגאולה שזה מוביל צעד חשוב בדבר הזה. אנחנו גם אומרים את זה בספר תהילים שאנחנו מדברים על בשוב השם את שיבת ציון, היינו כחולמים, מיד אחרי זה אנחנו אומרים, אז יאמרו בגויים, הגדיל השם לעשות עם אלה. כלומר, גם בספר תהילים ברור שחלק מהעניין של שיבת ציון זה מה אומרים הגויים על שיבת ציון. וכשהגויים אומרים, הגדיל השם לעשות עם אלה, אנחנו יודעים שהגדיל השם לעשות עמנו. זה התהליך, זה הגדלות. ולכן, האירוע שאנחנו מציינים 100 שנה לבלפור, הוא לא רק לציין את המהלך המיוחד הזה, ששינה מבחינה בינלאומית, מבחינת המעמד של מדינה, הכרה במדינה, בקרב האומות, בקרב העולם כולו, אלא יש בזה גם צעד אדיר מבחינת ההתפתחות, ההובלה למדינת ישראל, מבחינת לאומית פנימית של עם ישראל. אני רק רוצה לסיים, מה כתב אותו הרב קוק בעקבות הדבר הזה? כן, יש לאו דווקא להודות, אלא בייחוד לברך את אנגליה על זכות זו שזכתה להיות מחזיק, מסייע ותומך בתקומת נצחיותה של כנסת ישראל. תודה רבה.
תודה רבה, מר דובדבני, thank you. And now we are honored to welcome Mr. Daniel Mariashi, CEO of Bnei B'rith International.
Thank you very much. Before I deliver my very brief prepared remarks, I was sitting here and a memory flashed into my mind. My father was born in what is now Belarus. And he told me, in a small shtetl, it couldn't have been more than 500 people. And he told me this story. His best friend, who I never learned the first name, the last name was Berezin. And he and Berezin were very close, and on the night before, this is September 1913, on the night before my father, with his family, would immigrate to the United States, he told me the following. You know, they had in the house a picture of Herzl on the wall. And he and Berezin made a pact. And the pact was that one day, they would meet again in Eretz Yisrael. Now, they didn't say, we'll meet again. They didn't say, we'll meet in New York, which is where they were headed. They didn't talk about specifics. They talked about one day meeting here. Now, I don't know what happened to Berezin. I do know that the Einsatzgruppen moved through that part of Belarus and destroyed that shtetl and killed everyone in it, marched them to the edge of the town. But as we sit here today on this very special occasion, because it was only 4 years later, Balfour Declaration, this transformational event that put us on the path toward the modern state of Israel, to be in this building today and to have this program is really something very special. So, Speaker Edelstein, Lord Rothschild, Ambassador Quarry, members of Knesset, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to greet all of the speakers and guests and participants in this conference and to have helped in initiating its proceedings. I would like to thank our friend Knesset Speaker Yuli Edelstein for immediately agreeing over 2 years ago, as he said, to a proposal by the Balfour Centenary Committee, Chairman Alan Weber, and my colleague, B'nai B'rith World Center Director Alan Schneider, to hold this event and lending his support throughout a long process of planning. And also to Lord Rothschild for agreeing to deliver the concluding keynote address. We are grateful to all those who will share their important insights with us today. It's been a source of great pride that B'nai B'rith was actively involved in advancing Zionism in England at that critical period, the beginning of the 20th century. Indeed, many of the leaders of the Zionist movement in England at that time, men who contributed to the adoption of this transformational declaration, including Chaim Weizmann himself, were members and leaders of B'nai B'rith. London's Chief Rabbi Moses Gaster, diplomat Nachum Sokolov, and journalist Paul Goodman were among the other B'nai B'rith leaders who had for years worked tirelessly to realize the vision of a Jewish homeland. Their accomplishments still inspire awe. Here, in pre-state Israel, B'nai B'rith members including Dr. Wilhelm Zev Hertzberg, David Yellen, the father of the Hebrew language, modern Hebrew language, Eliezer ben Yehuda, and Yosef Meyuchas, laid the foundations for modern life here. Academics, physicians, city planners, linguists, and journalists, they established hospitals and libraries, sponsored the building of new communities, developed educational curricula for children and adults, countered the mission, housed and cared for those escaping persecution in Europe and Asia, and contributed to all aspects of support to the Jewish state. In 1980, when so many nations recalled their embassies from Jerusalem in response to UN Security Council Resolution 478, I am proud that B'nai B'rith became one of the first Jewish organizations to immediately establish a headquarters here we now call the B'nai B'rith World Center. And there, we undertake significant educational and cultural programs that build Jewish solidarity, promote Israel-diaspora relations, and enhance Israel's image. In our 175th year, with members on 5 continents, B'nai B'rith remains a voice of the Jewish community worldwide as we meet with heads of state and others and participate in international multilateral bodies like the United Nations, fighting anti-Semitism, supporting the state of Israel, advancing human and civil rights for all, and addressing causes of concern for all Jews. It is my sincere hope that this conference provides new insight into one of the most fascinating and momentous periods in modern Jewish history and in world history, and sparks a richer and more meaningful relationship between the United Kingdom and Israel at a time of great challenges and threats to both nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mariashin. This concludes our welcoming remarks, and we thank again the Speaker of the Knesset, Yuli Yoel Edelstein, who has to leave now for other obligations in a very busy Knesset day. Thank you again. Should I continue? I'm now honored to introduce the first session. The title is Historical Context, a Crucial Milestone in the Creation of the State of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, the histories of the United Kingdom and the State of Israel are connected, and the two countries are linked by significant historical events. The Balfour Declaration is, of course, one of those. However, not many people know the complexities and the challenges faced by those who were involved with the Declaration, what we might call behind the scenes of the Declaration. I'm not sure we have our... Okay. We may hear the co-chair of the Israel United Kingdom Parliamentary Friendship Group later, a member of the Knesset, Yoav Kish. But at the moment, I would like to welcome Dr. Martin Kramer, President Emeritus of Shalom College and Koret Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, to talk about the Balfour Declaration and the Jewish problem. Dr. Kramer, thank you for coming.
Good morning. It's a distinct pleasure to be with you this morning in my capacity as a historian. And one of the most striking aspects of historical accounts of the Balfour Declaration is the narrowness of the question that historians ask. Usually it's this: why did Lord George's War Cabinet do it? In retrospect, it seems so improbable. The Jewish writer Arthur Kessler called the Balfour Declaration, and I quote him, an act dangerously outside the cautious routine of diplomacy. The whole thing was unorthodox, unpolitic, freakish. End of quote. So that being so, the Declaration from its announcement invited obsessive speculation as to its real motives. Do I have control of this, or you? Thank you. This is the War Cabinet, circa 1916. Now, initially, the speculation ranged very widely, but much of it subsided when Britain opened the archives in the 1970s. We now know that the Balfour Declaration was very politic indeed. I won't detain you regarding the answers. The bottom line is that the British War Cabinet thought a declaration supporting a Jewish national home in Palestine would be good propaganda among the Jews of Russia and America, both tepid allies. These Jews would then use their supposed influence to keep Russia in the war and get America more involved. The British War Cabinet also thought British sponsorship of Zionism would give Britain an edge over France in the post-war disposition of Palestine. Britain, by assuming the noble burden of helping the Jews, would extricate itself from its 1916 promise to share Palestine with France, according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The brown area, which is Palestine, was to have been an international administered territory among all the allies. It was something Lloyd George wanted to achieve for reasons of imperial strategy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've simplified a very large corpus of historical research here, but you get the idea. It was realpolitik all along. Some have tried to show that Lloyd George and Balfour were motivated by religious sentiment. If they were, it doesn't show in the cabinet papers. The British there debated Palestine like they debated India or Egypt. They were thinking about preserving and expanding the red on the world map. John Kimchi's book on the Balfour Declaration is entitled The Unromantics for just this reason. The declaration, he concluded, was, quote, a strictly functional and unromantic bargain with the Zionists. And I would add, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Now, Zionist leaders, above all Chaim Weizmann, understood these British motives perfectly well. Weizmann also knew that once the guns fell silent in Europe, once Britain had Palestine firmly in its pocket, the British needs that prompted the declaration would vanish. What then would hold Britain to its vague wartime promise? What need would outlast the war? Weizmann's answer was what he called the Jewish problem. Now, there are historians who are totally oblivious to the Jewish problem. There is, for example, a historian at Oxford, just elected to the British Academy, who has repeatedly made this statement, and I quote, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, the Jews constituted 10% of the population of Palestine, 60,000 Jews and 600,000 Arabs. Yet Britain chose to recognize the right to national self-determination of the tiny minority and to flatly deny it to the undisputed majority. End of quote. Now let's leave aside the question of whether national home meant national self-determination. The Balfour Declaration promised to advance in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people. Not for the 60,000 already in Palestine, but for the Jewish people in its entirety. Now, there were, at the time, about 12 million Jews in the world. A little less than 9 million of them in Europe, and more than 5 million of them in the Russian Empire, which then included Poland. The Balfour Declaration was for them. against whom, I might add, the 600,000 Arabs of Palestine were but a tiny minority. And here you see the major concentration of Jewry in Eastern Europe. Now, post-Holocaust, we have come to think of the Jews as a small people. But at the time, there were as many Jews in the world as Egyptians in Egypt. Today, there are 97 million Egyptians. There were more Jews in Russia alone than there were Arabs in the entire Levant, Palestine, Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon combined. And the Jews posed a substantial problem. Not the whole of them, but those 5+ million in the Russian Empire. The Jewish problem for the world was that it seemed like they might begin to move. Why? The Second World War distorts our view of the First. We've forgotten just how devastating the First World War was for the Jews of the Russian Empire. The front lines on the east, between Germany and Austria on the one side and Russia on the other, swept back and forth through the Pale of Jewish settlement like a threshing machine. Thousands of Jews perished as collateral damage or from deliberate atrocities. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes, became wanderers on the roadsides and the train depots. The Russian army deported 600,000 in boxcars to the east. As Weitzman put it in 1916, and I quote him, "It is already obvious that the war will deal a shattering blow at what has been for centuries the great reservoir of Jewish strength. The havoc brought by the war to the Jews of Poland has been compared to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, and the comparison is by no means fanciful." Now think of that arresting analogy for a moment. By drawing it, Weitzman meant to say that the Jews were about to be dispersed once again. If so, this meant the movement of millions. Already 2 million had left the Russian Empire, mostly for America, but also for the East End of London. Sentiment against them was rising. Doors were beginning to close. Balfour himself, as Prime Minister, had tried to close the door to Britain through the Aliens Act of 1905. Who would take in another million, or 2, or 4? No country, Weitzman claimed, could absorb such numbers, no country except Palestine. But could it? Where was the evidence? This question first came up in the week prior to the cabinet meeting on the Balfour Declaration. And it was prompted by Lord Curzon, once described as the most traveled man who ever sat in a British cabinet. He inspired a famous piece of Oxford doggerel that began, "My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a most superior person." Curzon visited Palestine in 1882, and 35 years later remembered it as, I quote, "a tiny country which has lost its fertility and only supports meager herds of sheep and goats with occasional terraced plot of cultivation." That was in a letter to Edmund Montague. This remote recollection prompted him to write a memo to the War Cabinet at the end of October 1917 entitled "The Future of Palestine." And he painted a grim picture indeed. Palestine, he pronounced, was incapacitated by physical and other conditions from ever becoming, in any real sense, the national home of the Jewish people. Palestine, he said, was comparable in size to Wales. Wales, he wrote, and I quote, "supports a population of only 2 million. Yet the Jews in the world number 12 million, half of them in Russia. Because Palestine," and I'm quoting, "cannot, within any proximate period, contain anything but a small population, the country will not, in my judgment, provide either a national, a material, or even a spiritual home for any more than a very small section of the Jewish people." His unspoken conclusion, Palestine couldn't possibly solve the Jewish problem. Britain would be committing itself to a romantic notion, not a practical idea. Who could challenge the seemingly formidable Lord Curzon? This fell to the much younger Mark Sykes, a celebrated traveler in his own right, and in many ways the unsung hero of the Balfour Declaration. It was Sykes who shepherded the process, guiding Weitzman and Nachum Sokolov to go here and move there. Generally, he let the Zionists make their own case, as they did it extraordinarily well. But as against Curzon, he had to act himself, as only he could claim to know Palestine better than him. And he acted in a counter memo written 4 days later. In the course of a few pages, Sykes demonstrated a superior and detailed knowledge of the country, its climate, its agricultural produce, its existing settlements. Having known Palestine since 1886, he concluded, I am of the opinion that if the population is now 700,000, that granted security, roads, and a modest railway accommodation, it is capable of being doubled in 7 years. And with energy and expenditure, it would be quadrupled and quintupled within 40 years. But doing the math, Sykes was arguing for upwards of 3 million at a brisk pace of 100,000 immigrants a year. Unspoken conclusion, Palestine could go very far to indeed alleviating the Jewish problem. Now, it would be a mistake to think that the cabinet decision hinged on this debate. Political calculation decided that there would be a Balfour Declaration. And by the end of October 1917, Balfour and Sykes had the necessary support not just in the cabinet, but from Britain's allies. But very soon the Balfour Declaration would be shorn of its wartime rationales, but still not fleshed out in practice. To get the Balfour Declaration ratified internationally, it would need a new rationale. And that rationale would be this: only the Jewish national home on as large a territory as possible had a chance of solving the Jewish problem. Absent a solution, not only the Jews would suffer. Weizmann in 1918 practically threatened Balfour that the Jews might overturn the world. I quote him, "If the Jews do not obtain a satisfactory settlement this time, they will be driven to despair. I would go further and say now that the world will never have peace until the Jewish problem is solved in a satisfactory manner." Now, Weizmann knew how to build on Gentile admiration of the Jews, but he had no illusions. Admiration and fear often went together. And he thought that the larger the Jewish problem loomed, the more appealing the Zionist solution would appear. So Sykes, by deflating Curzon, had rendered a crucial service to Zionism. As the war wound down, Weizmann shifted his emphasis to the Jewish problem. And thanks to Sykes, he could speak of big numbers with less fear of contradiction. If he talked small, he would receive little. So he talked very large. For example, by late 1918, Weizmann was warning Balfour that mass emigration from Russia was imminent. In December, he told Balfour that, quote, "When things settle down a little after this war, Jewish emigration will assume formidable proportions." He also anticipated that, as he put it, countries which have hitherto admitted considerable numbers of Jewish refugees may make any further influx of such refugees very difficult. Balfour, Weizmann noted, concurred in this view. Palestine was the only solution, and Weizmann now named a stupendous figure. Quote him, "We should be able to settle in Palestine about 4 to 5 million Jews within a generation, and so make Palestine a Jewish country." And this was also the figure he used at the Paris Peace Conference. The message: give us a wide Palestine, inexpansive borders, and we'll solve our Jewish problem and yours. By the time the Balfour Declaration entered the League of Nations mandate, it had been transformed from a wartime expedient to a peacetime necessity. But did Palestine solve the Jewish problem? Here we come to the tragedy of the Balfour Declaration. In the 1920s, Weizmann and his colleagues came up against the harsh realities of economics. The Yishuv didn't have a broad enough base to absorb millions of Jews. Young pioneers were welcomed, so were moneyed entrepreneurs. Others were not. They would have been a burden. But they weren't lining up either. In the lands of the former Russian Empire, the situation of the Jews improved temporarily. True, there were horrific pogroms in the Russian Civil War of 1919. Perhaps 50,000 Jews perished, a forgotten chapter. But the Soviet Union, at least at first, gave Jews equal rights and national standing. For most Jews there, that was hope enough. In Poland, a new republic promised minority rights, and for a brief moment there was hope there too. Now all that changed with the worldwide depression in 1929 and the rise of Hitler in 1933, but by then the doors were closing. In 1937, a partition plan was proposed by the Royal Peel Commission. The part of Palestine available to the Jews, and you see it here on the map in red, shrank dramatically. Weizmann was pressed to answer this question. Did he still think to bring half of the Jewish people, 6 million, to Palestine? His answer, no. And I'm quoting him, "I am acquainted with the laws of physics and chemistry and know the force of material factors. In our generation, I divide the figure by 3. 2 millions of youth with their lives before them. 2 millions and perhaps less. Sherit haplita. Only a remnant shall survive. We have to accept it." End of quote. Ultimately, even those 2 million would perish, leaving only a few 100,000 to be collected from the ashes. In the entire period of the British Mandate, some 30 years, only about 400,000 Jews entered Palestine. All the talk of the millions was a dream. But was this an unmitigated tragedy? Weizmann would have thought not. He put it thus: if the question of the Jewish refugee gives a new spur to the Zionist effort, it is not, and never was, the primal motive. Zionism envisages more than a negative relief of suffering. Zionism was not to be judged by the quantity of lives it saved, but the quality of the sovereign Jewish life it fostered. And sovereign we have been. The Balfour Declaration didn't just open the path to Israel. It was the beginning of the end of the Jewish problem, that total absence of power that made the Jews forever wanderers. And for that, we should be thankful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kramer. We are now honored to welcome Professor Ephraim Karj, Director of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, to address the Balfour Declaration and the Arab world.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here, even though I'm going to speak on the side that is normally not mentioned very much with regard to the Balfour Declaration, and obviously views it with less favor. Just need to turn to what Mahmoud Abbas said a few days ago. He rather wrote that 100 years ago, the notorious Balfour Declaration was passed, by which Britain gave, without any right, authority, or consent from anyone, the land of Palestine to another people. He didn't, of course, say to its rightful owner, but he was wrong, of course, about the fact that Britain gave it without consultation and without any right. And this is a rather disingenuous argument as well, because the Arabs have never really argued against Britain that it didn't have the right to divide the Middle East after World War I. Their main argument was that the British didn't divide it fairly enough. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, the map of which you just saw, was in their account unfair and should have been improved. But the fact of the matter, of course, is that Britain did consult all its war allies before issuing the Balfour Declaration, including, of course, and most importantly, the United States of America, which entered the war in April 1917. But again, it was a completely different world. This was the imperial time. The national idea was just making its first hesitant steps as the winning powers after the war were partitioning the losing empires. The Ottoman empires, of course, but not only the Ottoman, the German Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, all of them were partitioned in the peace conference, which is broadly called Paris Peace Conference, even though, of course, it was held in many other locations. The European subjects of the great empires were given immediate independence. The Afro-Asian colonies or provinces of the ruling empires were deemed insufficiently developed to gain immediate independence and were put under a newly devised system of mandates that is, were put under the responsibility of great powers, which were supposed to lead them to independence. And as part of this, Britain received the mandate to lead Palestine to independence in accordance with the Balfour Declaration, which was written into the League of Nations mandate already in 1920, but the final official version came out 2 years later in 1922. Now, in the original agreement that, again, you saw, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Palestine, or the substantive part of it, was supposed to be internationalized. Now, the British never really liked the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which they signed, and from a very early stage sought to undermine it. And because they saw the French didn't really play a role in destroying the Ottoman Empire, which of course was true, and therefore they didn't deserve to be so generously rewarded. And one of the ways to undermine the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, was through changing the future of Palestine. And here, among other reasons, came the Balfour Declaration, which basically was one of the first declaration of national self-determination to the Jewish people. And as I said, the League of Nations issued the mandate. It was accepted by the entire international community because the League of Nations was the predecessor of what is today the United Nations. And the idea was not only accepted by the Europeans or by the West or by the great power at the time. The fact of the matter is that it received wide support even in what is today called the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, which was the rival of Great Britain during the First World War, issued its own so-called Balfour Declaration a year later. On the 12th of August 1918, it issued it in the form of a declaration of the Grand Vizier, which was supposed to become a law in the Ottoman Parliament, whereby it acknowledged the religious and national rights of the Jewish people to identify themselves in Palestine, and they offered all the help, so long as this didn't affect the rights of the indigenous or the local population, very much along the lines of the Balfour Declaration, with the addition that they spoke about religious rights and not only national rights. Of course, this declaration was issued too late. August 1918 was about 80 days before the Ottoman Empire surrendered. The Ottoman Empire didn't control most of Palestine at the time, Britain did. The Germans, who were the allies of the Ottomans, were the main driving force behind the Ottoman Declaration. In fact, the Germans competed with the British. The Balfour Declaration, one of the reasons again, was to come ahead of the Germans and issue the pro-Jewish declaration at the time, because both parties believed in the so-called international power of the Jews, which is a rather mythical idea, but at this time, as on many occasions, I guess, worked in favor of the Jewish national movement. So you could say that it was not completely genuine, the Ottoman Declaration, especially that it contradicted the principle which underpinned the Ottoman Empire or Muslim empires since the rise of Islam, which were based on Islam as the ruling religion and the inferiority of the non-Muslim or the Zimites, as they are called, the population. The Ottoman Empire was hardly favorable to the national idea, as the Armenians, for example, learned very well during the First World War and already before. And still they issued it for their own opportunistic reason and German pressure. Their main belief was perhaps that it would put them in a better position in the peace conference to gain the Jewish support, especially with regard to America, and probably they would be able to regain Palestine after the war. But still, even if they did, this is what they promised, and the fact that they viewed this kind of promise as the quid pro quo to the attainment of Jewish power indicate that they viewed the Jews as a people and not only as a religious community, and they viewed Palestine as the national or the ancestral home of the people, something that many Muslims and our neighbors, Palestinian leadership, don't accept to this very day. So the Muslim world leader at the time, the Ottoman Empire, accepted the right of the Jews to national self-determination, and they are by no means the only ones. There was at the time the nascent Arab national movement, the Pan-Arab movement. It was based on the so-called Arab revolt of the First World War, launched by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his prominent sons Faisal and Abdallah. Faisal was the leading one because Lawrence of Arabia, the very good, the master of spin, you could call him, liked him, and he brought him very close to the corridors of power in Whitehall. And Weizmann, a few months after the Declaration, set out for the Middle East at the head of a Zionist delegation. They went to Egypt, where they met a group of pan-Muslim activists who were living in Egypt at the time because the Ottomans would have probably hanged them. And he managed to convince them that the Zionist enterprise was a worthy enterprise. It's not going to undermine their position, so he got their support. He got the support of the Egyptian Khedive, later king, Fuad. But the most important contact he made during this trip was with Faisal. He went to see Faisal in Aqaba, where his camp was at the time. The two got along famously from the beginning, and Faisal spoke very favorably about the right of the Jews to national determination in Palestine, but was not willing to commit himself yet, because he said that his father was the notional head of the Arab movement, and it was too soon to discuss it. But then Faisal came to London 6 months later, in December. He met Weizmann again. By this time, Faisal had already established himself in Damascus under the wings of the British. General Allenby, who was commander of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, who drove the Turks out of Palestine, of Transjordan. And Faisal was trying to build this Syrian kingdom, which of course he wanted to expand much further. And to this extent, he thought he would get Zionist support, and the Zionists would bring American Jewry, and American Jewry would bring the American administration. In short, he wanted Jewish support for the promotion of his imperial ambitions. And as a result of this time he was much more favorable to the idea, to the Weizmann Declaration. He said there is he cannot understand why Jews and Arabs cannot coexist. Jews have always lived in the Arab lands, and the Arabs treated them well, and he doesn't see why the Jews cannot establish their own national collective in Palestine, and there is no contradiction between the two, and so on and so forth. Then in the evening he had a dinner with Lord Rothschild, and then he was even more forthcoming. And these conversations in culminated in January 1919 in the famous Weizmann-Faisal agreement, in which the Emir undertook to support the Balfour Declaration and to facilitate Jewish immigration to Palestine. So here was the head of the Arab national movement, the Pan-Arab national movement, which included all Arab national groups that expressed any national aspirations at the time, accepting the right of the Zionists, the right of the Jewish people to re-establish itself in Palestine. And a couple of months later, he even wrote a letter to Felix Frankfurter, a leading prominent American Zionist, Supreme Court Justice, in which he even amplified his pledges. And for several months afterwards, Faisal worked to implement it, and Weizmann was very pleased. And we have extensive correspondence with Balfour, with other British leaders, in which he praises Faisal and said it was a good choice. He's going to work together for Arab-Jewish coexistence, and so on and so forth. At the end, as we know, things didn't turn out this way. Weizmann underestimated Faisal's imperial ambitions. At a certain point, Faisal's appetite was whetted. He thought he could achieve much more. He had himself crowned king of Syria in its natural borders, which of course included Palestine, Lebanon, and even Iraq. And then he forgot everything about the Declaration, not that he disowned it, but effectively. And indeed, the first pogrom, if you like, in Jerusalem in April 1920 was exactly for this reason, because it was about the incorporation of Palestine into Faisal's kingdom. So Weizmann eventually concluded that Faisal had been Olorid, and the Zionists should look for elsewhere. Elsewhere was his brother, Abdallah, his older brother. He was frustrated because Faisal got most of the spoils of the war. He wanted his own kingdom or empire, the Greater Syrian Empire. Originally, he established himself in Transjordan, and then he approached the Zionists and offered them to accept the Balfour Declaration, provided they would acquiesce in one way or another in being part of a greater empire. Again, there are talks about this. It came to naught, even though relations with Abdallah continued well until his assassination in 1950. During the 48 war, it continued. But when we are talking about the early 20s, so we had the heads of the Arab national movement, Faisal and Abdallah, supporting the Balfour Declaration. Now we come to the actual inhabitants of Palestine, whom Mr. Abbas represents in one form or another this day. The fact of the matter is that there was no opposition, contrary to commonly held beliefs. There was no opposition whatsoever to the Balfour Declaration. We must remember, we must bear in mind that the socio-political order at the time, I mean, Islam in certain ways is very different from Christianity. I mean, both are imperial religions, both at certain point wanted world domination, but Islam came about in a very different way. Christianity, when it emerged, made a clear distinction between this world and the other. I mean, Jesus was not a fighter, not a politician. He was a preacher, you could say philosopher, ideologist. But Muhammad was from the beginning combined in his person the political and the temporal and the religious functions, and this continued throughout Islam. After Muhammad, there are the caliphs and sultans and so on and so forth. So in Islam, there has never been this differentiation between religion and politics. Secondly, the Islamic world didn't undergo the process of secularization, the advent of nations, we could say even democratization to a certain extent that Europe underwent. And as a result of this, while the Ottoman Empire, for example, was squeezed out of Europe in the 19th century by the rising national movements, starting from Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, what is today, and so on and so forth. In the Middle East, there were no national movements at all. The people continued to think in binary terms. On the one hand, there were the local loyalties to one's kin, family, tribe, city, and on the other hand, there was the overarching loyalty to the Sultan Caliph in its capacity as the political and religious head of the religious community. So there are no national movement whatsoever in this, what we call today the Middle East. There are two exceptions. One was the Armenians, which was the major national movement that began rising in the late 19th century, has been brutally suppressed by the Ottoman already in the 1890s, and then of course the infamous genocide of 1915-16. And the second one was the Zionist national movement, which was much smaller, and at certain point during the war faced the same danger of extinction at the hands of the Ottomans. There was a time that they expelled the entire population of Tel Aviv, and talking about Jamal Pesha, who was the commander of the head of the Levant. He was talking about repeating the Armenian precedents in Palestine. But the rest of the population, they spoke Arabic. They didn't feel themselves Arabs. They felt themselves loyal subjects of the Sultan. And therefore, there was no national awareness in Palestine. And you see it very clearly in British reports of the war as they're entering Palestine and advancing throughout the country. You see in repeated intelligence reports, they talk about the complete lack of nationalism in the population. And given these circumstances, there was no real hostility to the Balfour Declaration, as incidentally there has not been hostility to the Zionist return, as we put it, from the beginning of the century. People talk a lot, especially our propagandists, about the local opposition to Zionism, even before the First World War. There was nothing on the can. There are local clashes here and there, over grazing rights, over lands, but no more than that. And therefore, Balfour, most of them didn't even know the Balfour Declaration was made. Those who heard of it didn't really know what it meant. There is this famous case that is mentioned several times by historians about this major Bedouin landlord from the south. He said, tell Balfour to come to the south of the country because we have cheaper land to sell him. They didn't know what it was about. So it took more than a year for the first official protest over the Balfour Declaration to start emerging in the form of some educated people letters to the Britain. And even these didn't speak about the Jews infringe on our national right, but they spoke about the Balfour Declaration contradicting the will of the so-called Arab national movement for unification with Syria. And in this entire notion of Palestine being part of southern Syria continued throughout the mandate. I mean, you have it repeatedly, the Palestinian leadership talking about it to the League of Nations, which were, of course, observing the conduct of the mandate by Britain, to the Peel Commission that was mentioned here in 1937, as late as July or August 47, 3 or 4 months before the passing of the UN Partition Resolution, the official newspaper of the Arab Higher Council, which was the leadership of the Palestinian Arab, headed by the Mufti Haj Amin Husseini, spoke about Palestine as part of southern Syria. And as a result of this, if you look at the pattern of relations between Arabs and Jews in mandatory Palestine since 1920 to 48, and contrary to what most of us recall or believe, it was mostly peaceful. There are, of course, outbursts of Arab violence, but they are basically directed by the very militant leadership headed by Husseini, whom I mentioned, 1920, as I said, 21, 29, 36-9, but 36-9 was not even against Zionism. If you look at the results, about 10 times Arabs were murdered by their fellow Arab countrymen than Jews, and of course than British. It was, in the final account, internal struggle for power among the Arabs. Jews and Arab, on the whole, peacefully coexisted, and here, I have a few quotes. I'll just mention one or two. For example, the Peel Commission, in the report, they said, general beneficent effect of Jewish immigration on Arab welfare is illustrated by the fact that increase in Arab population is most marked in urban areas affected by Jewish development. A comparison of the census returns in 1922 and 31 shows that 6 years ago, the increased percent in Haifa was 86. So the population in Haifa, Arab population between 22 and 31 grew by 86% in these 9 years. In Jaffa, 62. In Jerusalem, 37. While in purely Arab towns, such as Nablus, Hebron, it's only 7. And in Gaza, it was 2%. So Arabs went to live with the Jews because, the Jews enhanced their economic, social, political, and other forms of well-being. And despite the outbreaks of violence and incitement, on the whole, this persisted. It persisted through the 36-39 violence. There were even cooperation at the military field during these years where a lot of Arabs, of course, fled Palestine at the time, tens of thousands of them, because of the persecution by the Arab gangs in what foreshadowed 47-48. And there were some who didn't want to flee, and they wanted to fight back, so they cooperated with the Haganah, which was the underground Jewish movement at the time, against their fellow Arabs. And even as you enter the First World War, And even as the Mufti was inciting from Germany for the murder of all Jews and conferring with Hitler, where, by the way, he didn't speak about Palestinian independence. He spoke about Arab independence, a kind of Arab empire, which he hoped Hitler would confer upon him. And even then, relations between Jews and Arabs in Palestine recovered on many fields after the 36, 39 disturbances or riots or our revolt, call it what we will. And this continued, of course, till the end of the war when different circumstances began. So to conclude, what I'm saying is that I find it a bit ironic that 100%, 100 years after the entire international community, including the leader of the Muslim community, the leaders of the Arab national movement, and most Palestinian Arabs accepted the right of the Jews to national self-determination, the head of the Palestinian movement today try to negate it, and I think it's time for him to start seeing reality for what it is. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Karsh. Thank you so much. And we are now honored to welcome Professor Simon Shama from Columbia University. From Columbia University to discuss the Anglo-Jewish community and the Balfour Declaration.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, of course, at this time and to celebrate what we're celebrating. Academics really try overwhelmingly to be led by their head. Possibly Jewish academics less than, but it's impossible, of course, not to be led by one's heart as well as one's head on a day like today, and through the celebrations that were marked so exuberantly and unapologetically in London last week. And in the sense of being emotionally moved as well as intellectually stirred and provoked, particularly by the contributions of my two distinguished colleagues previously, which a number of points of which I want to resume and take up and emphasize. It's impossible not to feel, particularly if you come from Britain, because British Jews were, after all, within just 22 miles, the breadth of the English Channel, from suffering the same fate as our European continental brothers and sisters. It's impossible not to feel, when you come to Israel, and I come a lot, the defeat of Hitler's extermination. Not to at all efface the atrocity and horror of the Shoah and those millions of Jewish lives that were lost, but he was defeated, and you're the proof of that. Israel and the Jewish people and the culture which the Nazis also wished to annihilate lives and flourishes. Now we're marking a 100-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which seems a very long time ago. But when I was born in 1945, the war was not yet over. I was born in the middle of a bombing raid, actually, which destroyed most of the street except the nursing home in which I was born. Another defeat for the Third Reich. It was just 28 years before that moment, and for my father in particular, both my parents, the way in which the East End of London, the way in which the modestly, not the grandees of the Jewish community, but the vast majority of the Anglo-Jewish population received that news was very fresh in his mind. He was 16 years old when news of the Balfour Declaration, about a week after that letter was sent to Walter Lord Rothschild. And he remembered it very well. he remembered in particular actually an extraordinary improvised eruption of celebration on the streets of Whitechapel and Stepney. There'd already been a celebration that Weizmann and Sokolow and the Zionist Federation had had privately on the evening, although famously, as he remembered in Trial and Error, Chaim Weizmann, when Mark Sykes came to him with bearing the document, Weizmann and Mark Sykes said, "It's a boy." Weizmann said, "Well, I didn't like the look of that boy. It wasn't what I was expecting," because he'd wanted the wording to be different. He'd wanted the wording, which was the case in one of the many earlier drafts Zionist Federation had submitted to the government, to talk about not the establishment of a national home, a Jewish national home in Palestine, but the re-establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Significant difference, and he wanted the sense of Palestine to be conveyed as, in its entirety, the Jewish national home. He didn't get that, but euphoria nonetheless broke out. But my father also remembered a week after that, a month after that, on December the 2nd, 1917, an official celebration of the Balfour Declaration, embraced as it was by the East End Jews, and I want to say a word in a minute about the difference between East End Jews and West End Jews. And my father remembers, because he didn't have any chance at all of being admitted to that illustrious celebration inside Covent Garden Opera House, standing with a huge swarm of Jews outside the Royal Opera House, as he told me, standing between sacks of tomorrow's cabbages and potatoes, as the Hatikva was being sung, as it was indeed sung on the stage of Covent Garden. And what I want to say is that one of the most remarkable things about the unfolding of the Balfour Declaration is that at that time, Zionism, organized Zionism in Britain, was numerically and in other ways very, very weak. There were perhaps no more than, at most, 5,000 members of the Zionist Federation. And they had famously little offices on Piccadilly. It was said that Nachum Sokolow's entire correspondence and archive could be fitted into a fairly small shoebox. That was the story anyway. But there's no doubt that if the Balfour Declaration was not made from the numerical strength of Zionism, the opposite was not true. What happened after the Balfour Declaration was an extraordinary flowering of Zionist support, both as official members of the Federation and emotively as well. But I suspect, nonetheless, actually, that emotively, in a non-institutional sense, Zionism was actually much stronger in Britain than strictly membership cards would have suggested. Everybody, my family, not my father, who was born in 1901, but the larger family, remembered the last great occasion when Zionism made its presence felt publicly in the East End. And that was 20 years before, in the summer of 1896, where Herzl came to give a talk reporting on his attempted negotiations in Istanbul, which would follow on, of course, actually, in 1898, when the climax of which was actually meeting the Kaiser in Jerusalem, here on the Street of the Prophets. But Theodor Herzl, in search of Jewish support, had made two visits to Britain, but the one in the summer of 1896 was after the publication of the Judenstaat. And again, very surprisingly, the Judenstaat was actually, amidst the Jewish community of Western Europe, a flop. It was not a success. Only 5,000 copies were initially printed in German. Something like 300 copies were printed in Britain. The editor of the Jewish Chronicle could barely, who was not a Zionist at that point, nor was the newspaper, could barely manage to mention it. But Herzl came to talk to the Jewish Working Men's Association in Great Ailey Street, just around the corner from Fieldgate Street, where there was a great synagogue where the Sharmas were living at the time. And a gigantic throng of people came from all over London, but particularly from East London, from Stepney and Bethnal Green and Whitechapel and Aldgate and Mile End. And that was the moment. Herzl was thunderstruck, actually, by the enthusiasm, because he was feeling in the summer of 1896 extremely beleaguered. Two people who'd been vital to his plans to try and mobilize support in England were very conspicuously missing from that crowd in Great Ailey Street. One was Colonel Albert Goldsmith, who'd been born in India as a member of a British imperial family and had subsequently discovered his Jewish identity. He liked to begin every conversation with the remarks, "I am Daniel Deronda," and who'd founded an organization called the Maccabeans, which had branches through Britain called the Tent, and with whom Herzl, rather extraordinarily, I suppose patrician to patrician, had thought he'd got on very well. The other was Samuel Montague, the businessman from the north of Britain, who'd also promised support. But they had both actually, once they'd read the Judenstaat, they actually thought that that, as they understood it, maximalist Zionist program, unlike the gradualism of the Chovevei Zion, was actually likely to queer the pitch, actually to cause more trouble for the long-term prospects of Zionism than this much more gradualist, organic plantation of a Jewish community in Palestine. So they were slightly recoiled from the notion, as they thought of Herzl's charismatic leadership, Herzl's insistence on crashing his way through the doors of powerful statesmen. And Herzl at that point in the 1890s was, of course, not at all committed to a British way ahead. If anything, he thought it was going to be much more likely that the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, William II, was much more likely to establish a German protectorate for a Jewish Palestine in return for the funding of the Ottoman debt. So in some extraordinary way, even though there was a moment, an event of great excitement and euphoria going on in 1896, it pretty much dissipated thereafter. And the Zionist movement and the anti-Zionists, as they thought of themselves, remained at loggerheads for quite some time, all the way through 1917. One of those who'd been a friend to Herzl, Lucian Wolff, the historian and essayist, became the leader of the so-called Conjoint Committee in England, which was devoted to stopping the Zionist project, at least in the sense in which Chaim Weizmann and Sokolov and the Zionist Federation wanted it. At stake, of course, for these two parties, who actually slugged it out in the columns of the Times in 1917, in May 1917. The editor of the Times newspaper was a man called Wickham Steed, who was really no friend either of Zionism or of Jews at that point, but he was prepared to give an arena to both sides. He made sure that the anti-Zionists got their oar in first on May the 24th, and although it's been suggested that he did a certain amount of delaying tactic because the Zionists came back with their counterattack on May the 28th, precisely at the time when preparations of the original draft were being made, not only by Weizmann and Sokolow, but friends like Mark Sykes, absolutely crucial to the whole enterprise, as Martin Kramer rightly said. So there was an extraordinary sense, really, that everything boiled down to that one word, home. A home, a national home for the Jews in Palestine. And for the anti-Zionists, who were led in the cabinet by Edward Montague, the notion that you could somehow legislate a Jewish national home in Palestine was about to open the Jewish community in England to charges of divided allegiance. And those on the Zionist side, well, it's all very well for Edwin Montague to say that, but his kind of home is manorial, as a great kind of country house, complete with game birds and avenues of elm and oak. But the sense in which really Montague, to be fair to him, had the sense that for hundreds of years, ever since the de facto readmission of Jews to England, led by the famous names, the Cousinhood, the Mercators, the Montefiores, the Goldsmiths, had struggled, and the Rothschilds to be sure, had struggled towards emancipation. And that this was suddenly going to be put in jeopardy. Montagu even called the Balfour Declaration, this is extraordinary, and again my father remembered that with great bitterness and chagrin, an anti-Semitic document because of the danger he thought it would put Jews in. Montagu's point was that if the British endorsed the idea of a national home, the next thing that you would know would be that Jews would be shown to the door and would be told, if that's your home, then go to it and leave us alone. And you have to remember that in 1917, there is a kind of undertow, there's a kind of ugly, slightly poisonous rumble of anti-Semitic literature and writing going on. Writers like G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, and the journalist Leopold Maxer. There had been, in fact, earlier in 1904, 1905, there had been an organisation called the British Brothers League, which had demonized the Jews, particularly the new influx of Jews from Russia, as unhealthy, uneducated, all these prone to criminal activity, everything that Jews in fact were not. But there was a kind of rhetoric that had a place in British public discourse and which led to the passage of the Aliens Act in 1905 in the government of Lord Balfour, I have to say, as well. Whether or not Lord Balfour, who then met Chaim Weizmann 1 year after the passage of the Aliens Act, was caused to have second thoughts about that is a very interesting historical issue. So the debate between two senses of exigency about what home for the Jews could mean met in collision inside the Jewish community. And what happened in 1917 was really the Rothschilds, so wonderful to have Lord Rothschild here, the good Rothschilds, because there were Rothschilds on the anti-Zionist side as well, particularly Leopold, notwithstanding the grandeur of their manorial establishments in Britain, chose actually to actively and eloquently and passionately to throw their lot in effect, with the East End rather than the West End. And I don't want to over-polarize it to say that the Montefiores and the Mercators and the Goldsmiths were all anti-Zionist. They were not. They split down the middle. Claude Montefiore, a mighty intellect, one of the leaders of the Reform movement, was a bitter anti-Zionist, but Francis Montefiore was actually just as much a passionate Zionist. But one thing, actually, which, even though Martin Kramer's quite right, it's very difficult to find rich evidence either of philo-Semitic discussion in the very beady-eyed talks that the cabinet had. Two things I think were very important in making sure that the voice of the East End, there is a sense not just actually of Russian Jews and poorer Jews dislodging the leadership of the cousinhood, but also provincial Britain. The crucial breakthrough, of course, for Weizmann was the fact he happened to be in Manchester. And in Manchester, he met Harry Sacker, the lawyer. He met Simon Marx. He met the C family. They were beginning to constitute an alternative cousinhood of knowledge, of science, of commerce, and of journalism. If anything, another unsung hero was Harry Sacker, because he was both a lawyer and a journalist. It was Harry Sacker who opened the door to the editor of The Guardian, C.B. Scott, and it was Scott who in turn opened the doors to the high and mighty of liberal politics of that period. It was actually through Scott that Weizmann met Balfour on an election campaign in 1906 in the first place. The predisposition towards listening to the East End, as it were, did come partly from, exactly as Martin Kramer said, the horrifying events that were unfolding in the First World War. I can't stress enough, reinforcing Martin's point, that we all think very clearly and in terms of the tragic epic of the relationship between the Shoah and the Second World War and the foundation of the State of Israel, it's as important to think of the First World War and the Balfour Declaration, or at least the sense of the critical issue of uprootedness, of homelessness that Pinsker had first identified in 1882, possibly even Moses Hess before that, playing a part. The figures are staggering of the casualties of the long period of turmoil in Russia and Central Europe. 600,000 indeed deported in boxcars back to the interior of Russia, but also horrifying pogroms that took place. 1,000 separate pogroms took place as Jews were caught, particularly in Galicia and Ukraine, between the two millstones of the Austro-Hungarian army on the one side and the Russian army on the other. The Russians behaved, possibly you'll not be astonished to hear, much, much worse. Not that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians were particularly tender towards the Jews they encountered, but they didn't tend to slaughter them and burn down entire cities as they did, particularly when the Russian army was in retreat. It's been estimated conservatively that 200,000 children were orphaned Jewish children, orphaned in the ongoing violence between the First World War and the ongoing civil war between 1917 through to 1920. And there are particular moments that were of an extraordinary horror. It's thought 250 burned alive in Fastov. Near Bogoslav, similar arbitrary, atrocious violence meted out to completely defenseless Jewish communities. Why? Why? Because almost the entirety of this huge amount of the Pale of Settlement were thought to be synonymous with spies. Yiddish sounded a whole lot too much like German. The great report of this, if you want to read it, is by the author of the Dybbuk, S. Ansky, who himself had had a career in and out of orthodoxy and then became a social revolutionary, writing only in Russian, came back to writing in Yiddish, mounted a great ethnographic expedition into Volhynia and Podolia in 1912 and 1914. He comes back to the heart of the Pale, the heart of Jewish Russia that he knows very well in 1915. He sees Brody burnt and charred, destroyed, as if he said he was looking at Pompeii. He hears horrifying stories of, a father and son who are taken out to be hanged as spies. I have to say that there was a legend going round which triggered pogroms, that Jews had a secret telephone network by which they communicated Russian troop movements to the enemy. All this is in Ansky's own astonishing account, which was published after his death. I really recommend it to you, called The Destruction of Jewish Galicia. Terrible account of a father who was ordered by, a son who was ordered by Cossack soldiers to hang his own father. They'd both been convicted summarily as spies. And the son said, of course I'm not going to hang my father, and said, well, we'll hang both of you. So his father pleaded with him to hang him, which horrifyingly the son did. And then Ansky says the soldiers sat around laughing while the son was hanged in his turn. There are, other than the industrial Zyklon B nightmare of the Shoah, there's not much about the horrors of the Einsatzgruppen or anything that was not anticipated in the explosive hatred and violence inflicted on Jews around that time. And that is a very, very important context. As Martin said, it's a context for thinking that there was going to be an immense wave of Jewish migration. And bear in mind too, as Martin implied, that because of the Aliens Act, it was very unclear actually which countries, if any, could absorb those who were lucky enough to get out of this death trap between the colliding armies. Remember also that in the United States there'd be increasingly restrictive immigration acts, culminating in the Act of 1921, which again put Jews in an impossible position of desperation when they would, in the end, most need it. Now, the East End, including my mother's family, sorry to inflict all this personal information on you, who were Lithuanian, not like my father's family from Izmir in Romania, my mother's family still had relatives actually trapped in the Ukraine at that time. So the East End knew something of the scale of horror that was being inflicted on these Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe. And that, I think, actually fed into the intensity of their suddenly growing enthusiasm for Ein Brera, if you like, for the absolute imperative of a Zionist solution. On the other side, I do think it was probably important, even though cabinet records in their dry-eyed way don't bear it out, that there was a long tradition in the British literary and chattering and political classes of thinking sympathetically about the connection of Jews to Eretz Israel, to Palestine. Weirdly, the first argument I know of, which actually was an explicit championship of the Jews being encouraged to return to Palestine, occurs in the 1714 pamphlet written by the deist John Toland, which was mostly really about, which was essentially about the importance of naturalizing the Jewish community, which was already in Britain de facto, because the Jews were not essentially, and again this rhetoric will go on right into the Balfour Declaration, the Jews were capable of extraordinary acts of economic transformation. Toland, who was Irish and a very, very interesting writer, by the way, if you don't know him, Toland actually thought the first place the Jews ought to economically transform, possibly en route to their eventual destination to Palestine, which he inserts at the back of his booklet, was Ireland. And I suppose actually if you'd wanted an even stormier Zion to actually settle in, Ireland would have fitted that particular bill. But the notion that actually Jews simultaneously, on the one hand, were capable of everything that anti-Semitic Canard said they weren't, capable of enterprise, of knowledge, of applied technology, for want of a better word, that they could actually regenerate, which was the buzzword lands, which were usually thought of as incapable of being regenerated, was a particular kind of strand in that political economy thinking. So was, of course, Christian restorationism, sometimes called Christian Zionism. The aim of Christian Zionists was, of course, to re-establish a Jewish presence in the Holy Land, because that was supposed to hasten the eventual mass conversion of the Jews, which in turn would bring about the second coming of the Savior, Jesus Christ. So this was the long-term theological, eschatological program. But in the meantime, it was possible, especially through the 19th century, for Jews and Christians to park their own particular fundamental differences about that conversionary timetable and achieve a certain kind of companionship. It's very important to remember, I think, actually, that this sort of comradeship, notwithstanding Christian conversionary enthusiasm, goes back a long way. I'm always reminded of a wonderful moment, actually, which I describe in volume 2 of The Story of the Jews, of a genuine friendship between the Cardinal of Viterbo, Egidio Antonini, and Eliyahu Bahur, the great Kabbalistic scholar, because they were both interested in Hebrew Kabbalistic writing for very different reasons. But Eliyahu Bahur had actually been teaching Hebrew to the sons of young Italian aristocrats in northern Italy, and when his library was destroyed by the troops of a particular war in 1509, the cardinal invited him and his family to live in the cardinal's palazzo. They were able to park or suspend the ultimate complete incompatibility of their religious destinations to have a comradeship in Hebrew. Such comradeships recur in the Dutch Republic. They recur, of course, famously between Moses Mendelssohn and the playwright Lessing, and they occur a lot in the 19th century, not just George Eliot's famous invention of Daniel Deronda, but in extraordinary figures like Lawrence Oliphant, who'd been MP for Stirling, who is a kind of Christian mystic, but who comes to Haifa and buys land in order that a kind of prototype of an agricultural settlement, a kind of odd version of the kibbutz, could be inaugurated in Galilee. And Oliphant sees again something that, as Ephraim Karsh said, the possibility of the Jewish return not necessarily being to the disadvantage of the Arab population. He feels that very, very strongly. So I think actually there is a kind of, if you like, sedimentation in the heads of people like Arthur Balfour, certainly in the head of the man who was the final editor of the Balfour Declaration, Leo Amery, who was a secret Jew and who was put in the cabinet by Lord Milner, an ultra-imperialist, but who is the person who designs what he takes to be a document that will actually pass a majority of the cabinet. There is a kind of sedimentation of philo-Semitism. I think part of the reason that happens, part of the extraordinary closeness between Mark Seitz and Weizmann, is that, as has been said before, Weizmann knows how to be Jewish, but not too Jewish. He knows, he has all the skills of creating political friendship that Theodor Herzl, in his kind of tortured, charismatic way, did not quite possess. Weizmann could turn on, like a tap, the sense of the epic of Jewish homelessness and the glories of the Jewish past, what had been shared in those moments of comradeship and friendship. And at the same time, he had an absolutely steel-like Machiavellian grip on the nitty-gritty of political negotiations. And part of that shrewdness on Weizmann's part came out of, and again now I'm stealing Ephraim's remarks or simply wanting to reinforce them, was the genuine belief that it would be possible for a Jewish national home and an Arab national awakening not to be a zero-sum game at all. That meeting with Faisal, it was an extraordinary journey that Weizmann made in the broiling, violent heat of the summer of 1918. They went by boat, but then went by camel, then they went by foot, before eventually they got to Faisal's encampment. And I'm not sure if you mentioned this, Ephraim, but of course the person who contrived the introductions and goodwill between Faisal and Weizmann was T.E. Lawrence, someone who in less sophisticated British historical law is thought to be absolutely a pan-Arabist beyond anything else. Lawrence, in his crazed romantic way, he too believed in what you might think of as the open-hearted, open-ended version of the Balfour Declaration. So when we celebrate the Balfour Declaration, when we celebrate the victory of East End courage, fortitude, chazak ve'ematz, their sense actually that Zion, that a Jewish national home, was ultimately the answer to the epic of homelessness, and it did not prejudice the possibility of a diaspora Jew also feeling an unqualified allegiance to his own home. We indeed ought to be celebrating the possibility of Jewish and Arab understanding not endlessly being on a collision course. And I know you're going to take me as naive and high-minded and a typical professor, but there was someone else in London, someone very close to Weizmann, who wants this to be true, even though he's alternately an optimist and a pessimist. You all know who I mean, class, don't you? He's the agent for the Vysotsky Tea Company, better known as Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am was as important to Weizmann as a friend and as a conscience as Nachum Sokolov. Achad Ha'am is someone who wrote Emet, Eretz Israel, who was the first person to draw attention to the fact that if Zionism was going to succeed, it needed at least to confront difficult truths about the Jewish-Arab relationship. And I think that Weizmann took Ahad Ha'am's deep sense of conscience, that to be a Zionist you had to face Emet Eretz Israel, truth from the land of Israel, with him when he made that long, impossible journey to Aqaba. So when we celebrate the Balfour Declaration, paradoxically, we want indeed to go back, if we can, not wipe away, you can't wipe away history, but to close, or try and close the chapter on all the horror and all the bloodshed and all the misunderstanding, and see the Balfour Declaration out of its time, not just actually as the inception of the realization of a 2,000-year-old dream, but also as something which is open to the possibility of a peaceful, expansive, transformed future. And we should celebrate that, and celebrate the Balfour Declaration with a full heart and a critical mind, and with the extraordinary sense of courage and determination that everybody in this building and Jews on the right side of history all over the world share too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shama. And this remarkable speech concludes our first session. Ladies and gentlemen, you are cordially invited to the buffet lunch, which will take place in the lobby just outside this auditorium. We will begin our second session on UK-Israel relations promptly at 2:15.